And welcome to another episode of The Focal Thought. My guest today is Amy Thiessen. How are you, Amy?
I am doing pretty well, Croydon. Thanks for asking.
Great, thanks. So, Amy, you're a coach, you're a performer, a facilitator. This is with In Resonance Coaching and Sundari Studios.
Yes.
And you are an international coach. You're creating transformational experiences of self-expression and human connection. You also facilitate some yoga, and you weave that with your performances and also the wisdom of the body and voice. And your music and presentations have included performances with Wanderlust, Janet Stone, and TEDx. And some of your work has also been featured with Gaia, Globe and Mail, CBC, CKUA, and Travel Alberta, Stampede Sessions. So welcome to the episode.
Hi, thank you for having me. It's really sweet to be here.
Right. First off, I want to say what a great voice you have. I've checked out some of your music videos on Facebook, and I encourage the listeners to do the same. I usually say that the human voice is an instrument on its own. It doesn't really need any sort of musical accompaniment if it's got the integrity that it should have when singing. And yours has that. You've got a good blend of hitting the intonation and the vibrato as well. So it's a very nice voice to hear.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Which leads me into the topic of today's discussion, the embodied voice. I wanted to ask you about this because, there's two aspects here. There's, the therapy of using your voice. And then there's also, the therapy of living in your body, expressing, your body. That's the somatic side. So I wanted to ask, what is so therapeutic about singing? What is therapeutic, even if you're not able to sing, just to be able to express using your voice?
Mm-hmm. We can hit this on so many levels, but I find for a lot of us, for whatever reasons, we end up kind of cutting off our voice. Maybe we were told when we were young we can't sing, or we were told to be, seen but not heard, all these kind of things that can come up. And voice and singing can become this really sensitive space. I find when I'm working with clients or with groups, our voice is it's really intimate. It's how we express ourselves in the world. And so when we look at singing, not about performing, right? It's not the performative aspect, but about reconnecting to our body and actually allowing these parts of our body to have expression. It ends up being really liberating for various reasons. It's liberating in the sense of, if I go back into let's say a really innocent or tender part of myself, right? And I let myself not just feel it, which can happen in meditation and all these practices that are beautiful, but actually kind of sing from that space. It's almost like this part of me gets to be heard, and it gets to be known in a different way that isn't just internal. It's manifest through voice. And so it creates this kind of really interesting positive feedback loop where not only am I kind of sensing into the body and allowing these spaces to express and then hearing them. So I'm becoming better able to hear my voice, not just hearing in sound, but hearing in sensation, feeling oh, there's an ache there, or there's space there, and letting that out. But then singing itself is highly regulating, right? It stimulates the vagal nerve. It helps to regulate our nervous system. So as even emotions might be coming up, or experiences or images that are almost dreamlike, or memories start to come up, we're both going through the process of expressing it, but we're also through the process serving in self-regulation, serving in a way of actually integrating these processes and integrating these spaces inside of ourselves.
Got it. Okay. So the body's actually getting a chance to speak, right? The different part that you're expressing through the voice.
Totally. And the body, at least in the way that I look at voice, and this comes from a lot of my own experience as well, is just our body holds things, right? Our body holds trauma, and by trauma, just things that haven't been able to complete. When I haven't been able to speak up for myself, or I haven't been able to do that thing, or whatever it is, or something happened. When we sing, it's I don't have to get caught up in the story of it. I don't have to get caught up in the why is it happening and what does it mean. It's just I actually can just sense it and express it and skip those other pieces.
Sure. And you can sort of experiment with that at home. If you just let out a scream, you can actually feel it vibrate through your body, right?
Totally, totally. And when we actually do some of that in the program, more like roaring, like ah, like that kind of sound, you have to like it's there's a balance, right? I don't want to get someone to just scream and then they kind of just like disconnect from everything.
Yeah.
But when you do it, you might find, oh, I'm shaking or something's coming up, and it's like, well, now this part of your voice is actually getting reintegrated. This allowance to have that much power inside of you and to actually express it starts to integrate. And so, yeah, exactly. Like you might find you shake, you feel it, it hits you. And I mean, the way that I look at voice is when I sing, especially if I'm like really in it and I'm really feeling, or I'm in some sort of a ceremony and kind of sensing energy and singing from that space. When I'm done, it can be like I can be shaking. It can be like I just went through some big cathartic something.
Yeah.
And I find that the capacity to have voice is actually the capacity to like just be comfortable with that wider lens.
You actually did this fun exercise where you were doing different types of sighing. So you were doing
Yeah.
a sighing coming from the chest or coming from the heart, even coming from the head, and you can really tell the difference. And you even sort of did a voice sort of exercise from the same areas, like the
Yeah.
chest, the heart, the throat if you're nervous, the head, and you can literally hear the difference. And I never noticed that before. I was always thinking the voice is the voice and that's it, but the voice is really a reflection of what's happening inside your body.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think we do intuitively sense that with each other. Like if we look at like leaders, and people are drawn tend to be drawn with leaders with lower voices, men and women. And even as I speak to you right now, like I'm feeling this in my belly. Because I'm in my belly, I'm less in my head. I've done this so long now, I do map to my body a lot. But if I were talking to you kind of like this and I was more up here, the way that you would hear me would be different because I'm located in a different place. I'm not as grounded. I'm maybe a little less centered, or I'm really excited, or whatever kind of energy is going on. I think we sense that in each other. Right? We hear it. We can hear excitement in someone's voice. We can hear nervousness in their voice. We can hear when we're with someone and they feel steady. We generally can hear a bit of that in their voice. I just don't think we think about it very often.
No, no, for sure. And like I've always said, we're not born with an owner's manual for the mind or the body, how to go through life. We're figuring these things out as, we come across,
Totally.
in these years. Do you think that the voice should follow the body, or the body should be led by the voice? What are your
Oh,
thoughts on that?
I both. I think that's what's really beautiful about like this type of work is let's follow from the inside out. Like, go to that feeling, a sense of tenderness or a sense of strength in my belly, and then express like from that inside out. But there also is, if I'm, let's say, with somebody, or I'm doing, something like this, I'm doing a video and I get nervous and I find myself talking up here, then I will like intentionally map, like shift the way that I'm speaking, which will in turn change my mental state. So sometimes it's about kind of listening what's there and letting it express as it wants to so I can hear it. But on the other side, I can use my expression as a way to kind of realign to my intention or to a sense of grounding or peace.
Got it. Okay. So if someone's, say, feeling nervous or scared and they speak in that voice, they shouldn't suppress it. Maybe just let it come out for a little bit and then be aware of it, right? So then you know what to change.
Well, yeah, I think one of the hardest things, and I mean, we might have done this even in that session you were speaking of, is to me, the primary thing always is permission. So if I'm speaking, let's say, really nervous because I'm anxious, my nervous system is maybe, let's say, in a bit of a flight response. I'm a little bit shaky. So my voice is like this. We often will have something in the nervous system that's happening. And then we have our judgment around it, like, oh my gosh, I should be able to speak, or I should be clear, and like all those like shoulds and the berating or the anger, the frustration of self. But what's happening is just the nervous system is like our physiology is just doing something. It's not good or bad. It just is. And so when there's a permission to be like, oh, okay, it's okay that I'm nervous. Like it's okay to be here. And I can notice that. now I can actually approach myself, approach each other, approach whatever I'm doing in a more, my dog's making noises, in a more cognizant way, right? So like, I'm nervous, instead of being like, okay, I should be able to do this, this, and this, it's going to be like, oh, I'm nervous. Okay. I'm just going to become aware of that. Let myself kind of settle, maybe become more aware of my belly, and then speak from there. So the idea being, when it comes down to it, it's really a lot of presence and permission. I find in communication, one of the greatest challenges is thinking that we should be somewhere that we're not, right? Like, I should be able to speak up to that person. But if we've never been able to, and our nervous system has a very strong response to that person, then maybe we're just not able to yet. And when we can meet ourselves where we actually are, we can actually start to progress forward. Okay, well, where can I do this? Where does it feel safe? Where can I express myself? I don't know if that makes sense, but I hope so.
No, it does. No, and like you're saying, the awareness is important. The presence is important, because with embodiment practice, it's all about, the sensations in our body, being aware of it, being present, and then also regulating it, right? That's the important part, the balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the regulation is, the regulation comes from being present and giving it permission to be like it is.
Yeah. And there is a time and place for things. In some of my previous work as a disc jockey, when I had a career in music, you've got the typical disc jockey voice, which sounds great in an entertainment setting. But if I'm using that at home or at work or talking with friends, that's not the time and place, even though it sounds confident and it sounds, very assuring.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love that you say that.
You're not going to blend in properly. I find that, people not being aware of, embodiment and, not having the owner's manual, letting trauma affect them. Do you know why people might not be comfortable in their bodies? Because when we're born into our bodies, we are off our bodies, but really we're not coming from our bodies, right?
Totally. Yeah. I love that you asked that question. I think that's a very deep question. There's probably people that could answer it in a lot more layers than I can. From the somatic standpoint, from the somatic experiencing standpoint, and from that kind of template, which I lean into quite a bit, when we think about like a baby or a kid, and we can also look at like more the psychology of like Carl Rogers, all of that stuff, when we're met, right? When our needs are met, when we express and our needs are met, like we learn like, oh, that I said I had that emotion was mirrored to me. I understand it now from a conscious place. It's not just an impulse that's coming through. So there's the expression, but then there's also the consciousness around the expression. And I think what happens when we encounter different things in life is that there ends up being these mismatches, right? So maybe, I feel nervous or I get anxious and I get yelled at for being anxious. So instead of it being like, oh, that's just your nervous system, I now see that part of me as bad. And so I try and push it away, not consciously. I don't think any of us do this on purpose. Or maybe there's a parent or a guardian or somebody in our life where we're always having to be hyper vigilant. Maybe they get angry and it doesn't make sense or something happens. And then there's always this hyper vigilance, which disconnects us. It kind of puts us into a fight response, a flight response, or a freeze response, which I encounter a lot. In my work, I primarily work with women, but it puts us into these responses because we're not able to have a fight. We're not able to flight. We're not able to say, I'm not okay with that. One, because we don't necessarily know how to do it. And two, because we're in an environment where that wasn't allowed. And so all of us are going to have conditioning. I don't think conditioning is a bad thing. It's just life. But how and how that conditioning affects each person is going to be different. But ultimately, there's going to be these spaces where there's, who we are, what we actually feel, what we actually think, what's actually going on. And if we're never allowed to actually express that, if that always gets shut down, it gets dismissed, it gets moved away, then it's hard. Then that connection between those impulses ends up kind of getting severed by kind of our brain saying, no, this is the way you should behave. This is the way you should sound. Wow. So we learn to kind of almost bypass them. And generally, at least in my experience, a lot of the bypassing happens in the mind. Okay, this is how I should, and this is how it could be, and blah, blah, blah. Whereas embodiment is saying, let's say I'm angry at somebody. Let's say somebody does something and it's painful and it hurts. A version of me 10 years ago might have been like, oh, it's okay, I forgive them. And I just skipped to being compassionate without actually feeling my hurt or my anger or my disappointment, because I shouldn't feel those things. Whereas now I actually will pull back a little bit more, let myself feel the hurt, let myself feel the disappointment, let it happen, not ruminate, just feel the sensations. And then from that place, I can actually let that dissipate and forgive, right? I can be like, yeah, okay, this, and I'm forgiving them, right? There's both. Then the weight of that experience, it lands a lot better. It lands a lot more true for me. So for example, in something like that, I might say, oh, I'm compassionate, it's okay. And I kind of skip. For me, what happens is I end up becoming kind of passive aggressive, or I get really anxious. Like I keep going over that same thing. Could I have done it differently? Should I have acted differently again and again? Whereas if it actually goes to, oh, wait, I am sad. And I kind of let myself come to terms with my emotions and like experience what's there. Then when I have forgiveness, it's a lot more real. Like it doesn't come with the stuff that I'm repressing. It doesn't come with as much passive aggressive behavior or that kind of thing coming up. So I guess to kind of put it all together, these are big topics and I think about them a lot, but
Yeah.
It really comes down to impulses in our body are not moral. They're not good or bad. They're just impulses. But we kind of create stories around whether they're good or bad. And so I think some of them we push away because they're connected to a trauma or a story, instead of being able to just have the impulse itself be experienced and expressed.
Got it. No, so that's interesting that you say that the freeze is much more worse than the fight or flight. And I think,
more common, I would say, for me personally, but yeah.
yeah. No, and then the wave should come all the way to the shore and crash. So I guess too often we might suppress that wave from reaching the shore and cut it off by, drinking, drugs, etc., forgetting about it, just saying that's okay,
Totally.
things like that.
Well, even like spiritual practice can be like that. I've definitely done that and used my spiritual practice as an escape. Right? Like in this space, everything's good, but then I couldn't actually speak up in my life and say, yeah, that's a boundary, or that's not okay, or wow, that was totally my fault. Right? So anything can kind of do that. And I think the interesting one with freeze, and this is, now I'm talking really personally, because this is definitely one of my more default patterns that I've been looking at and, working with therapists on for a while. But with something like freeze, when we come out of freeze, often it comes with anger. Like when we start to come back online, there is like the anger or the flight response that didn't get to happen because it went into freeze response. So then I think people also get nervous of that, because when they're actually coming out, they might feel like rage, or they might feel really like, but not in a disconnected way, in a very connected way. But that can be very unnerving, especially if, we're told we're not supposed to have that experience. So even in the healing process, in the kind of thawing process, there might be an intense physical sensation and we don't necessarily know how to address it. And so it's quite layered and it's quite individual. Every person is going to kind of have different patterns mapped into their system, depending on their, genetics, their environment, their circumstance, everything. So.
Got it. And, this is not just only with sort of, negative things. This can also happen with positive things. So,
Totally.
Kids who are trying to express just, by being noisy, they've got a lot of energy.
Totally.
And they get suppressed in the classroom or at home. They're not allowed to, feel themselves fully through.
Totally. I love that you said that, because like think of that little kid. I probably was that little kid. It's like, la, la, like just giving her, and like thank my parents for the fact that they let me give her, because they did. But how many kids are like, no, don't do that. And so then that becomes like, oh, that's bad. But it's not bad. It just maybe wasn't the right location.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And if I may just speak to something you've talked about with the DJ voice, because I loved that you brought that up.
Yeah, no,
I really
for sure.
loved it. So in the program that I run, on week 5, we talk about archetypes. And I have one of the archetypes, and I just do a bunch of singers, and archetypes, the way that I work with it is just like, what is this singer like? What do you feel when you hear this? And there's that very performative, almost theatrical singing. Like, I think of Glee, like, don't let it rain on my parade, like that kind of singing.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I'm using this archetype, which is kind of like the DJ archetype. Like, here's my voice, here I am. Some of us will listen to that. And some people are like, oh my gosh, that's really fun. It's really outgoing. Like, they're really comfortable taking up space. Someone else might listen to that. It's like, oh, they're just being arrogant. That's all ego. That's this, that's that. You shouldn't speak like that. And I find that really interesting because it's just like, there's no real right or wrong in it. It's just like, it's a voice. So we can learn from those voices that we find really uncomfortable, like the performer archetype, or like that DJ voice. There are strengths in that voice, right? There's like a quality of projection. There's an ability to take up space. Yeah. There is a bit of like like me, look at me. And of course, we don't want that to be the only voice in the repertoire that lives inside of us. But that voice is incredibly beneficial and useful when it's integrated. Correct, right? It's useful to be able to use it when you need it. And so I find with like the somatics of that is it okay to be comfortable with these different voices inside of me? Not that I have to use them all the time, but that I have access to them when they're appropriate.
Correct. Yeah. And on the flip side, from the DJ voice, if you had a yogi who spoke in a DJ voice, you might not believe him too much, or her, right? I mean,
totally. It's all about how you're meeting your audience as well. Yeah. It would be a heck of a yoga class.
So this is great for, actors and actresses in movies, when they're sort of doing different roles and, even different moments in their character, to adopt, the different voice sort of tonations that they have, right?
Totally.
For feelings and for settings and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to me, I don't know. I haven't spent a lot of time in acting, but to me, I think the actors that are like profound are the ones that they're not putting on a voice. That voice is coming from inside them. They've found these places inside of themselves and now can express from that space, right? They can tune into it. And I think we all have all of these voices inside of ourselves, right? All of these aspects, all of these sensations, these energies. Of course, there's patterns that, like, we have personalities and there's going to be differences, but that ability to just like be able to express from those different places.
Sure. And I can tell, with the different people I speak to, whether it's family or, work colleagues or, in a professional setting, an entertainment setting, the voice changes, and it's almost like I'm a different person in each setting.
Yeah, absolutely. May I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Does that feel like, how do you feel about that? Does that feel okay to like change voices and like have those different spaces?
First, I always wanted to have almost like the DJ voice, like if I can sort of demonstrate. So if maybe I wanted to speak like this and, be very articulate about my words, that was sort of like the go-to podcast voice maybe. But then I was saying that's, not really my average personality, I guess. So the way I'm speaking now it's fitting for the podcast, right? It's just, it showcases my personality.
Yeah.
So I don't mind having, those different voices and in different settings, because if I'm telling a story, the tone's going to be totally different if I'm giving a lecture, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I just had to ask, I really appreciate it. And one of the reasons I asked is I know a lot of people are like, well, that's not authentic. And it's like this idea of authentic voice just being what's an impulse, whereas I think it's being mindful of the impulses internally and then having the presence to kind of contain the expression in it, like, or channel it or move it in an effective way, so that it's okay if, exactly when you're being the DJ, you put on that voice because that's kind of the persona and you're playing into that part of yourself. It's a spectrum. And then with your family, you have a different voice, one that's probably going to be more tied into those dynamics, but that it's okay that we do sound a little bit different with different people because every environment is going to be a little different. And so to actually meet the environment is a blending between our own kind of sovereign state and what's happening around us. And
Yeah,
to me, it's
that's
that like ability to pivot, but always be kind of in your center. It's like you have one foot in the center and you're stepping the other foot out into these different directions, but you're just allowed to pivot through these different places. And so when I look at somatic experiencing, it's really just in voice relationship, it's really just creating more integration in those pivots and in those transitions.
and then authentic, by that regard, you're saying is flexible, because I guess a lot of people might think
Totally.
that authentic should be an absolute, consideration, but it's not, because in the moment we might be nervous or brave, or our authenticity
Totally.
is going to change based on that.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I'm nervous, my authenticity in that moment might be that I'm just nervous. It's not, I get this a lot. Like I give myself like the freedom to speak with clarity and ease. And I'm like, well, that's a lot of pressure. Like that's a lot of pressure. Because what happens when you're nervous? Then how does that respond? Whereas if you're allowed to just be nervous and meet it, then it's easier to be authentic, to actually like meet yourself and then speak from a place that feels more true.
Correct. Yeah. And I guess with people like, musicians and artists, they're very famous for, transferring the pain that they have in their lives into their art, right? So, I mean, if you look
Absolutely.
at the country genre, we might not have as many romantic country songs as we would. There wasn't enough pain. But really, I used to think that might be a healthy way to do it, considered to compared to some other, ways of getting out your frustration. But then
Yeah.
from what you're saying, the embodied way is really the best way, because even though you're transmuting your pain to your art, that's really not fully releasing it, right? You have to let the body and soul release it.
You just like explained my life journey. I wrote, I mean, so my original records are under Amy Thiessen. Those are where you catch my like first two records. And the breakup, they're heartachy. They're like, oh, this is my pain. And it was very much like that. It was like, and I don't regret it. Like it was kind of self-indulgent, fair enough. But like I think it was good. I really got into like, feel this pain, understand it. Like I'm just expressing it as an art form. But what I found is I would ruminate in it. Instead of actually moving it and healing it and letting it out of my system, I would just spin in it and trying to get the perfect words to articulate it. Where, I mean, a lot of that kind of pain, a lot of that stuff, it's not a clear thing. Sometimes it's a convoluted mess. And it was after my second record, and I had like, I mean, honestly, I just had a really big breakup, and there was like a lot of layers to that breakup. Um, and I'd always sung mantras. I'd always been singing prayer songs as well. But then I went more into that, and I started to sing, and it was like, it was the same pain. But now it wasn't about me. It was just the sensation. And it was almost like that was, for me, the meaning of that is like, that's a shared humanity. We all experience pain. We've all experienced hurt. We've all experienced frustration. And then to sing was less of a like, listen and hear. So you know that you're not alone. It was more like, I'm offering it to grace. And for me, grace, and we actually talk about this in the program, is really just that which makes you feel loved and accepted no matter what.
Nice.
Regardless of if, you believe in God, or you're an atheist and you connect with nature, or you have like a really cool aunt who was always really awesome. Like just something that, this is more the psychology, Carl Rogers, unconditional positive regard, that which is going to love you no matter what, that no matter what you say, no matter what you sing, it receives it. And so it's that. It was like, I'm just going to sing, and I'm going to let these things out. The grief, the pain. I'm not going to ruminate. I'm not going to try and artistically stylize it. I'm just going to get it out. And that was such a huge like paradigm shift for the way that I was doing music, because it was not so much about the stories. And I love like a good songwriter, like their work. I have such profound respect for it. And I think the really great ones are the ones that transcend that they do this like way of allowing the human experience to be felt and released.
Oh, and it can definitely be felt in art for sure. I remember there's a musician called Frank Combali, and I listened to one of his albums called Passages, and there's one song there, which is a ballad song, and it's an instrumental, and he plays it on the guitar. And it's the most beautiful, melody that I think is out there, for his genre. And the way he plays it, on the guitar with the technique, it's really great. But, it always makes me sad, makes me a little depressed when I hear it, even though it's a beautiful melody. And I got the chance to ask him, once after a concert when I met him. You made this great album. The composition was really nice. The melody was great. And he said, yeah, that was a good album for me because that's the era where I divorced my spouse at the time. And I took it out on the album, and I transferred my pain there. And I said, yeah, you also transferred your pain to me through that song. And it was just funny to know that, so it can happen. Transfer to the art transfers to the audience base.
Totally. Totally. And I think it also gives, I mean, I don't know if this is true, so please, I'd love to hear your thoughts of, yeah, there's pain in that, but it kind of tones you into like, yeah, there's pain in human life. Like there's pain. And like that essence of the pain, we all know. So to me, it even those hard places where maybe you transfer it, it also gives us a space to like connect to our humanity, to connect to each other. Because even though you didn't know him, you felt him.
Yeah, I felt exactly what he was feeling at the time, for sure.
Which is pretty magnificent.
The power of music.
It boggles. Like it's all the things theoretically we can study, and then and I'm sure you've experienced this, you get to be a part of like a jam or like a thing where people are singing and it's like sounds and things just come out, nobody's thinking, and it's like every theoretical thing just goes poof, to be like, that's what that is, but describing that is.
And that's why what you're doing with the voice, it's important, because the voice is in real time showing you what's happening in the body, if you can attune to it.
Totally. And it's such a healing thing to actually express. I mean, meditation has been a part of my life for a long time. Yoga, all these things have been very much my life, my adult life. And when you actually can express it, you can actually let it out in sound. There's like this different, I find this like connection that's it's just very right here, right now, very tangible. And when you get to see someone catch a part of their voice that they haven't, reclaim it, remember it, find it for the first time, whatever, and it comes out, not out of like, I'm thinking I'm going to do this, but like just out of a felt expression, there's an energy burst. There's a Shaktipat in yoga, but like there's like something that just opens, and often there's emotions, because it's like it's like catching yourself, a part of yourself that you didn't even know was there, and hearing it, not just feeling it, but hearing it. So it's right there in front of you, which is, I don't know, it's really freaking cool.
Yeah, I know, and I like that, because from what you're saying, the emotions are meant to go and reach that burst stage. They have to bloom and get out there, and energy is neither created nor destroyed. It just transfers and moves on and on.
Totally. And I think as you know your voice, then your ability to express those emotions at first is messy. Like it's often messy when you're first exploring a voice. When I'm first exploring, let's say, the voice of innocence, there might be all these wounds. I might not want to feel them. This stuff might come out. But then what happens, and this is something that, I'm not going to say it always happens, but I think this happens for a lot of incredible artists. You may have experienced this, is like if I'm on stage or I'm singing in a ceremony or something's happening, the magic is when it's not even necessarily my emotions or my stuff. It's like I'm feeling there's like an energy that's being expressed through happens to be my voice at that time. And so it's like this conversation energetically of beautiful music can like catch energies and emotions, or singers or guitar players, anything. And then it's like they can almost play the healing of it. They can express it through and allow it to kind of be heard and be experienced in a different way, where it just doesn't necessarily have to be as fragmented. It actually finds a sense of resolution.
Got it. And they're the conduit of this healing.
Yeah, and it's literally just a conduit. I don't know if that's happened for you, but like if you've played like a show or a performance where it's like you almost stop being there. It's like you just kind of watch it happen through you.
You transcend. Yeah, in your early stages you're worried about the sound and
Totally.
reading the notes, but if you played a gig enough times, you're beyond that. You're thinking about dinner or what's happening after the show, or you're watching someone. You're right. Yeah, you transcend the moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that can happen.
No,
even to
that's
the point.
great. And you've got your course starting soon, right? The
The
embodied
course
voice.
actually just completed, so it'll
Just
start
okay.
again in the fall. We just finished. It was, yeah, it was really profound. It was really profound. It's actually an extension of a course I did last year, but I realized I needed way more time just on voice. So the Embodied Voice course just completed, and it'll start again in October. And then I do one-on-one sessions. I do a lot of one-on-one work with people working on both voice and expression. So the embodiment of voice, but also into how do we communicate in a connected way, right? In our relationships and in our life, how do we communicate? Even into a bit of work in like facilitation and leadership and how to use voice. But something that I just want to say is that I found really interesting in my own journey. If you ever want to look at a TED Talk from like 10 years ago when I did it, I hear myself speak, and I used to talk a lot more like this. And this is where I spoke from. And at that point in my life, you know, saying no wasn't really easy for me. Setting boundaries wasn't really easy for me. There were a lot of places where I wasn't able to kind of hold that weight. And what I find so interesting is as I began to do that in like my life, like getting clear on my boundaries, just being a little bit more kind of firm with who I am, what I need, those type of things, my voice changed. It dropped lower. And I find something fascinating, and this has happened a number of times when I've worked with clients that maybe want to work more on the singing, is we end up circling around to things like boundaries or, you know, understanding what we want. And then as that happens, as there's a greater depth of understanding in that, then their voice, their singing voice actually changes.
Wow. And once
Super
again,
cool.
because the voice is the reflection of your physiology.
Totally. It's just such a magnificent instrument. It is so incredible to me how it works and how it works, you know, between different people, but also different cultures and different things that you can learn from, you know, listening to music from all around the world or like experiencing musicians. It's just really fascinating to me.
Sure. Wow. No, that's great. And once again, thanks for coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us. And if people want to get a hold of you, they can go to your website.
Yeah, amythiessen.com. So AMYTHIESSEN.com. I'm also very Googleable.
Okay, and I'll put that in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Your pleasure. Thanks again, Amy, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Thanks.